Oh, I can tell you all the secrets. No, I won't.
Key trainer must be the person who teaches the interpreters how to open the boots.
That's right. I've got this really big key ring, and then I go from one booth to the other.
I can just imagine the janitor opening up, like locking up the boots last thing at night, going, "What have they done in here?"
Easy. But he's not here today, so it's all us.
Exactly, that's why I can make that joke and get away with it.
He's sitting in an interpreting booth somewhere.
Lucky boy.
What is he actually like in person?
I had a colleague who had the hots for him.
You see where this is going?
Great starting point.
Welcome. This is Troublesome Terps, the podcast about the topics that keep interpreters up at night. And I have the good news first for you today. It's not going to be a pure manual, as is often the case, so that's good. And you've heard him there. I'd like to welcome, first of all, our interpreting scholar from Edinburgh, Jonathan Downey, PhD. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Calling me our interpreting scholar makes me sound like a little pet. Maybe I'm a Scottish or something. But
You're actually our resident interpreting scholar, so there you go.
That's true. We are missing one of the crew. Our iconic lineup is incomplete today because we have lost our little elf. Alexander Gansmeyer is off interpreting and enjoying the life of luxury, I'm sure. But we wish him all the best, and we hope when he listens to this podcast, he'll go, "I'm sorry, I missed that."
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's going to say that. And there was a hint in there with the little elf. We'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, I wanted to welcome today's guest, Karin Reithofer, who joins us from Vienna. Good evening.
Hello. Hi.
Hey, good to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So I said there was a little bit of a hint in there because tonight we are going to be talking about English as a lingua franca. And if you abbreviate that, it gives you a tiny little elf. So that's the topic for today. Exactly. Because as we all know, everybody speaks English extremely well. And that's why interpreters are doomed. So that's the setup for the show tonight.
Positive setup.
Yeah. Well, we always start on a positive note here. Exactly. But I'm going to introduce our guest first of all, because I've known Karin for a few years now. I'm not going to go into any more details because we're still young at heart and all that kind of stuff. Yes. I suppose we both work for the European institutions. Karin is an accredited freelance interpreter for Romanian, among other languages. So that's how I know her, because I have Romanian too. And I suppose we started more or less at the same time. So shortly before Romania joined the EU in 2007. Is that right?
Yes. No, I had my test in 2007. I think you were already accredited then, weren't you?
Well, that's close enough.
Yeah. Well,
yes. Exactly. You are based in Vienna, Karin?
Yes, I am.
But that's not why you studied interpreting, is that right?
Well, I did my first MA at Graz University and then slowly walked my way up. No, I actually went to London after that and did the Masters in Conference Interpreting in Westminster. It's still running.
Poor old Westminster. Yeah.
Yes, good old Westminster. Very good course, unfortunately. It's not around anymore. And yes, then I went to Romania, where we two actually met. I think you came there with your MA in Germersheim, didn't you?
Yeah, with the EMCI, that's right.
That's where we met. Yeah. And then only after that, I came to Vienna to do my PhD here in Vienna, where I'm based now.
Yeah. So we'll get to the PhD in a minute, but first of all, I'm curious. How did you know that interpreting was for you? Did you kind of stumble into it? Did you always know you wanted to become an interpreter?
Oh, difficult one. No, not really. I mean, I always liked languages, and after I did my A levels, I went to first London and then Italy, and hoped that in that gap year I would finally know what I was going to do. And then when I came back, I still didn't really know. So I thought, okay, interpreting sounds interesting enough, and then it really turned out to be interesting, and turned out I wasn't completely useless at it. So yeah.
No, I can confirm that you are not.
We haven't actually worked together though. So have we?
I don't know. Maybe once or twice. I don't know. Not very often in any case.
No.
Yeah. Such is the life of the little interpreter cog in the big European machine, as it were. Okay. So you knew that interpreting was a thing, and sort of you were good at languages and thought that could be something for me.
Yes, absolutely. But, I started off in Graz, and I didn't really know what would be a good choice of languages. So I started with a great combination of Italian and Spanish.
But that is a good combination.
Well, not really. And then I did some Russian. And after that, I said I should also add English to my official combination. This is really why I did the MA in Westminster. And yes.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
English, obviously.
How many languages do you have?
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised because I didn't know you had Russian in there as well.
No, I don't have Russian. No.
You were going to start from scratch then?
I did Russian for, 2 or 3 years at university, and then I realized it's too much hard work.
There's a lot of hard work, I can tell you.
Just on, I can just order something or say hello or something like that.
Well, at least you're not starving. That's good.
I did 2 years of Russian, but sadly forgot it all. But yeah, Russian is an incredible language to learn, and it's great because it prepares you to try to learn German.
Yes, that's true. That's very true. I think they're on the same level in terms of difficulty. It's so difficult, and I admire anybody who speaks one of those languages, not them being their mother tongue. Really incredible.
We have quite a lot of German going on in our house at the moment. We're becoming a bit of a languagey family, which is great. It's great when you finish work and you walk into the lounge and you go, which language is that they're watching TV? They're watching YouTube in now.
And turns out it's Scottish.
That much I would understand.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Karin, I don't know if you have the same experience there, but people who work with Romanian and who are not Romanian usually get the question of, why they learned Romanian in the first place or where that came from. Not really sure we talked about this, but for the audience and for Jonathan's benefit, tell us about your Romanian origin story.
Family origins, because that's usually the first question that you probably also get a lot from colleagues, no?
Exactly.
Because people look at your language combinations and they go da 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 da. Okay, silence. Oh, Romanian, and
that's interesting.
So exotic.
And then everybody asks you whether you have Romanian family or Romanian family origins, which is quite likely being from a Germanic background. But no, unfortunately, I don't. I had to learn all my languages from scratch. I didn't have the nice help of, growing up with 2 languages or 3 or 4. So I started Romanian really late when I was, after I did the MA in London, I was more or less told by the EU or by some people in the EU that, having 3 working languages isn't really enough for us. So maybe I should add another one. And then there was this program by the European Parliament called the Training Assistant Grant, which I was awarded. And then I went to Romania to teach there. Basically, it's typical win-win situation where they send a graduate there and have somebody speaking their mother tongue there for the students, and the person at the same time learns the language. That was the idea, and it worked out. So yeah, probably the language I know not least, but where I probably have the most gaps. And still, it's a language, you probably know that, Alex, that people, always commend you on. Romanians will always go, if you just speak half a sentence of Romanian, they go, oh, you speak such good Romanian. But which is it is a nice motivator, really.
It is very sweet indeed. Yeah.
See, I have a bit of Romanian family connection because my brother spent 3 years in Romania as a missionary, and now translates and interprets between English and Romanian. Our family, when we were growing up, we often had Romanians through, so I'm used to stuff like that by now.
Oh wow! As a missionary to Romania, really?
So you're used to them bringing booze and stuff?
Well, I'm used to stories.
Yeah.
I am really used to stories of Romania, and the Romania-Moldova border is like etched into my brain circuitry somehow. And also, so I mean, this is the thing. So in the UK, we have a lot of monolinguals. There was no way I was ever going to grow up a monolingual because I grew up with all sorts of people through our house all the time. And I grew up reading stories of the 1989 revolution in Romania, of the end of Ceausescu's reign. I grew up reading about Hungary. My earliest memory was watching the Berlin Wall fall down. So I was always plugged into the world, if you like. Yeah, I haven't been to Romania. I must go at some point.
You should. You should. It's really beautiful.
It is really beautiful. Yeah. So after that little sort of side note on Romania, how did that work with the grant? So you were already eyeing to become an interpreter for the institutions, and that's kind of the deal that you made with the parliament? And or is it really just about the teaching, or afterwards do they kind of promise you or give you that perspective of taking you on or letting you take the accreditation test or that sort of thing?
Yes, they kind of, well, you have to agree to at least sit the test, which I think nobody would oppose to anyway. So, yes, well, they invited me, but it's obviously I had to pass the test to then work for them. And yeah, that's the agreement. They give you the money, and well, even if you don't pass the test, you've still been there and helped students with German as a working language to work on their German and so on. So yeah, it's good. It's really nice leap into a different world.
I guess, yeah. But speaking of different worlds, I was curious about the PhD that you then embarked on. So did that run in parallel, or did you just freelance for a few years and then later on decided to go more into research, or how did that whole thing happen then?
Well, I got back from Romania and I came to Vienna, where I didn't really know a lot of people because I hadn't studied here, because that's how you usually, make the first contacts with ex-students or ex-teachers. So I didn't have that. Yeah. And so I thought, well, I'll start freelancing a bit, which I didn't go that well. So I thought, okay, I might as well do something that, helps me in some way. So I had a former colleague from Graz who did her PhD with Franz Pöchacker, and we met, 3 of us, and he was very enthusiastic about my idea of looking into this English as a lingua franca thing. And yeah, then I just started to work there, and we got a third-party funded project, and yeah, it all just started to run. It always feels like I didn't really choose that. It just happened somehow.
Yeah, which often happens, I guess, at least in the field of interpreting. That's my impression.
Yeah.
And so that topic was your idea then. Do you remember how that sort of came up, that idea of this topic, I mean?
Well, I think it's so obvious for anyone who's in interpreting, because you're just faced with non-native speakers of English so often as the speakers that you have to interpret, and you have all these colleagues moaning about it and saying, "Oh, it's horrible, BSE,"
yes.
and
badly spoken English.
Yes, badly spoken English. And I obviously had that attitude as well, and so I thought, well, I want to look into that, and I want to see whether interpreting is maybe still better or has an added value compared to English as a lingua franca communication. And yeah, that's how it all started.
So, I mean, I noticed here in the notes that you were part of the wider project on quality and simultaneous interpreting. Was that the same project that Cornelius Wischenberger was on?
Yes, And she was actually the colleague that I just mentioned before that who introduced me to Franz Pöchacker. Yeah.
Because she and I have had a lot of discussions, because my PhD wasn't about conference interpreting at all. It was about interpreting in church. And it was the same. So 6 months into my PhD, I completely changed track because I wasn't going to be able to do what I wanted to do. And I ended up looking at expectations of interpreters. And again, for an interpreter, that's kind of an obvious thing to ask, what are our clients trying to get us to do? And that's how I came across Cornelia's work. And there seemed to just be this stream of work that was heading in the same direction. It was a lovely period in interpreting research. It was just a lot of work going the same way. It was great.
Totally. Yeah.
But I think, so how did you find, so you mentioned that you came into the PhD with the same ideas that a lot of people had, that, this badly spoken English and English as a lingua franca is this horrible thing. And to an extent, I still hear it. But was that your impression at the end of the PhD, or did you find out things that you weren't expecting?
No, actually, my attitude changed completely, but not just because of what I did myself, but also because I got to know the so-called ELF team of the University of the University of Vienna, the Department of English Studies. So there's a big research group that focuses exactly on English as a lingua franca in the field of English studies. And their attitude to English as a lingua franca is like the complete opposite of what we have in mind when we think of BSE and so on, because they say that, well, considering the fact that 4 out of 5 speakers of English are nowadays non-native speakers, we have to stop judging them by native speaker standards. We have to stop saying it's native speakers who determine what English is and what standard English is and so on. And, even though there was some resistance on my part at the beginning, I kind of got to see their point, which I think is something that all interpreters more or less should acknowledge, that it's true that English is just used by so many non-native speakers, and very often it works quite okay. Well, at least the communication flow isn't stopped completely. And just because we have a lot of problems with it as interpreters doesn't necessarily mean that it's just crap altogether. And that's more or less the change of attitude I had till the end. It still happens to me that I'm in the booth and I think, oh my God, why doesn't he speak his mother tongue? And it's so annoying. But in general, thinking about it afterwards, I go back to my more peaceful attitude.
No, but it's true. But there's a lot of there to unpack. First of all, what is English? Because even among native speakers, there's a lot of variety in English, from Australian English, Canadian English, what have you, and other varieties. And then, also the definition of what does lingua franca mean? What's the purpose of using English? And I agree as well that there's a specific attitude in some interpreter circles towards that. And I mean, there's a difference as well. Sometimes the speaker's native language maybe isn't available for interpreting, so they have no choice but to speak English. And sometimes they do have a choice and they choose English for some reason. So I think it's much more complicated than meets the eye at first.
I think there's also a social variable. So English is still at the moment a highly prized language. And it says something for a business person that they can stand up and address a meeting in something approaching English. I think as interpreters, we often get locked into, as Karin said, and you were right, about what's good for us. But if you think about it, it gives an amazing impression for someone who's trying to, impress an audience of 300 people from all around Europe. If they can address the conference in the prestige language, it makes them look better. It might not make our job easier, but if they do well, it makes them look better.
If they do well, yeah.
If they do well. I mean, I have a story of, I was doing a construction conference and there were 2 Italian presenting teams. The first Italian team decided to present in what could be generously called English. and all 4 interpreting booths were just going, but you could see even within like 5 minutes, even the audience were kind of banging their heads off their chairs or going onto their phone or slowly swinging backwards and forwards. And like no one went to that company's booth at lunchtime because they were like, we don't know what they're doing. I think it was at break time. And then the second Italian team came up, realized there was an Italian booth, spoke in Italian. My Italian colleagues did such a good job, they actually got highly commended by our professional association. And that Italian team got a standing ovation.
Wow.
And you think, you don't really need to present any more of a case than people fiddling with their phones versus standing ovation. Which one would you rather have?
Totally. But I think that's the thing. You can't talk about the English as a lingua franca. You have highly proficient speakers of English, which can use English very well in any communicative setting, or you might have a communicative setting where it's okay to use not so proficient English. But I think what's a problem with interpreters sometimes is that whenever somebody starts speaking English with the slightest accent, they go, oh. And I think that's sometimes a bit counterproductive, because we limit ourselves because we're already so annoyed with it that we spend so much energy on being annoyed that it takes some time to then get into the interpreting mode. But that said, it's still totally true that there are some speakers that are just not interpretable. Does that word exist?
It exists now, so.
But I mean, we had this discussion on Twitter recently about, should interpreters have a neutral accent? Well, one, there's no such thing. Linguistically, there's no such thing as a neutral accent. So but also, I wonder if it's to do with the prejudices that we have as interpreters, that because we find certain accents easier to interpret, would rather hear that from both sides, when actually, I enjoy it on, if I'm doing fisheries policy or certain manufacturing jobs, when I'm interpreting a Scotsman. Especially, if there was once where they flew people up from London for a job, and people who'd not really heard Scotsman before were like, how are you interpreting him? It's like, this is normal.
It's a second nature.
Yeah, well, I totally feel you. Well, being Austrian, I have colleagues from other booths constantly telling me, oh, these Austrian, they're impossible to understand, and how do they speak? So I totally understand what you mean. And I totally agree, yeah.
But I mean, given all these complexities and the many things that sort of play into English as a lingua franca, how did you even approach this? I mean, where do you start? Do you look for definitions, or was there any previous research maybe on this?
Well, funnily enough, there's not a lot of research, and there still isn't very much research on the topic, even though practicing interpreters talk about it's definitely one of the main topics of the interpreters I know.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Complaining mainly about English as a lingua franca. Well, I wanted to approach it from the conference interpreting perspective, because the thing is, the ELF scholars, they mainly look at English as a lingua franca used in very dialogic settings, so where you have a group that discusses, and then they say, yes, it always works because they have this cooperative attitude, these ELF speakers, and they just help each other, paraphrase, and use all these linguistic tools to make themselves understood and to understand the other. But well, being an interpreter, that isn't always the case, and that's why we often struggle, because we usually work in very monologic settings where you have one speaker talking to the audience, and they might have the possibility in the end to ask some questions, but they won't be linguistic questions. So I wanted to look at this type of setting and see whether in this type of setting interpreting still has an added value. And I can already give you a little hint whether
spoiler alert.
I got that hypothesis confirmed. Yes, I did. Yay!
Excellent.
And yeah, that was the starting point, more or less.
Sorry, Jonathan, just a second. But was there any literature outside of interpreting studies? So just as a general linguistic topic for ELF?
Yes, a lot of work.
Okay, because that's what I would have expected
Yeah,
to see.
yeah. But mainly because it's this very ELF is a very young discipline within English studies. So it used to be, it's not anymore, but then it used to be quite, I don't know, positive and optimistic, and yes, it works so well, and you have to stop just talking about standard English and so on. And that was quite difficult for me at the beginning, because it was so the opposite of what I thought about English as lingua franca until then. But it opened up my attitude and my mind to it as well.
I think I've seen a couple of researchers. I think Michaela Abel-Mikasa has done some work, and there seems to be a bit on ELF, but again, it's the dealing with our natural prejudices as interpreters, that when we research ELF, we will tend to, talk about it taking over and maybe making interpreting obsolete, or talk about how it's causing problems with different markets. And how do we get past the tendency for interpreters to find a scary side of everything? Technology, it's going to take our jobs. ELF, it's going to take our jobs. It seems like everything we put our hands to is going to take our jobs at some point in time.
Well, on the one hand, I think you have to acknowledge that it's partly true. It is true that English as a lingua franca did take a lot of jobs. In most countries, on the private market have the situation that it's for an international conference. Maybe you have in Austria, for example, German plus English for all other international guests or speakers. So I think that is a reality that you have to acknowledge. But on the other hand, there's things that you mentioned before, that people see that some people just don't get or can't get their message across in English. So I think it's acknowledging that it is definitely competition to interpreting. It's a different mode of communicating in a transcultural way, but interpreting can have an added value if done properly and on a very high quality level and so on. I think, I don't know.
I'm beginning to think about some previous discussions that we've had on the podcast, and also perhaps there's a book coming to my mind right now. I'm not sure which book.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm curious.
No, so I wrote a book, 2016, it came out, published by Routledge. It'll be in the show notes. But the first chapter of my book was basically, if interpreting is going to survive, we have to be adding value. And it seems that it's funny, it's whatever conversation we have as interpreters, whether it's technology, ELF, clients being pickier, rates, it all comes back to, are you adding any value?
Totally. No, I totally agree.
And it's becoming the central thing. On the flip side of ELF, and this is something I didn't expect, I was at a conference called International Confex, which is where one of the big international forums for the events industry. And one of the leaders of an events management software manufacturer was on a panel on diversity. And his view was the ELF in the events industry is actually becoming less popular, and they're actually going back to truly multilingual events, or just doing an event in the language of whatever country they're in. So could it be that the trends that we've seen in interpreting could be tending towards reversing, perhaps because people have seen the problems of ELF, or because diversity is becoming more of a thing, or because the power of English maybe, there are several mechanisms that might mean that the whole trend could reverse. Are you seeing that, or would you be surprised if that happened?
I think totally reversed, no, probably not. Because, I don't know, some 20 years ago in Austria, you would have these big conferences with English, Italian, Spanish, French, and so on. And I don't see that happening on the private market, at least in Austria. I don't know what it's like in Germany, countries like that. But there's definitely the thing that for sometimes very very delicate settings, or settings where people realize that they will make a fool out of themselves if they don't speak English well enough, there you can see the trend, and I think that's something that you can see in the EU as well. No, I don't know if Alexander agrees, because you used to get a lot of politicians who spoke really bad English, and then they found themselves on YouTube, and everybody made fun of them, and then they realized, oops, maybe if I want to get across or get my message across and not look like a fool, then I might want to use an interpreter. And I think that that's something that does happen more and more. What do you think, Alex? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the situation plays an important role. So if it's something that's public, then I think there would be more of a wish to maybe use interpreting to get the message across. And also, I mean, it's always been true that interpreters make for a nice, I don't know, like nice props almost, because
we're also good looking, isn't it?
Yeah. Also, just the fact of using interpreters, it shows that you're a politician of a certain standing, that you can avail yourself of interpreters. So I think that's one thing. So maybe in closed meetings, it's already different. But it's also true, I think, that and I think you mentioned that a bit earlier, that there is this sort of expectation in the wider public that politicians or people who go to these international meetings are supposed to be fluent in English, whatever that means, whatever you understand by fluent. So I think for me, there's no clear trend in one or the other direction. It's sort of different factors at play. And I find it difficult to say where the whole thing is headed. I'm not usually a doom and gloom person, so I wouldn't say, English is going to take over in the next 5 years. But let's just say I'm a bit more pessimistic about the development of English, or ELF to be precise, than I am about the development of language technology.
I think this is the point, is that we can't fully forecast. I was surprised to hear that from the guy at the International Confex. But then on the other hand, it kind of makes sense, because I did an interpreting job not so long ago where I found out that the chief executive of the British company spoke fluent French, and the French buyer who was coming to try and sign off on a contract spoke fluent English. But the French buyer said in French at the start of the meeting, I could do this in English, but I don't want to. And the chief executive told me at the end of the meeting, I understand French perfectly, I just didn't understand what was going on. And it's those kind of experiences, and I must say I've seen them more in business interpreting than I have in the kind of more procedural conference interpreting. You don't hear that so much at AGMs, but when it's a business deal or when it's a big conference, when they're trying to sell some goods, you do hear people say things like that, or come up to you, thank you for being here and making a difference. It's when they see that they couldn't have
so nice
without us that they're happy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've never ever in my entire career had a client come up at the end of an AGM or anything internal admin and say, we couldn't have done it without you, because the reality is they probably could.
Yeah, but I think that's the same thing in politics or business. When they want to sell something, well, in business they want to sell, I don't know, product or whatever, and in politics they might want to sell themselves to their voters and so on.
That's a good point.
Just looking at the European Parliament, all the plenary debates, well, they're very multilingual, because the politicians then put it on their Facebook page, or I don't know, on their personal website, or that's a way of communicating with their voters. Whereas maybe in, I don't know, a trilogue they might happen to be in, they will probably speak English, because, well, they're just, I don't know.
Nobody will ever know.
I mean,
it's true though.
It is I've had colleagues really complain to me about, this job being lost and that job being lost. And my answer is, well, where are the jobs being created? It may be that we lose the internal AGM administrative stuff, but in return, we up our skills and we get the press conferences, the PR, the sales, the outward-facing stuff. And that's kind of okay, because a good thing about outward-facing stuff is it tends to create more outward-facing stuff.
Oh, totally.
So if you get a good sales meeting, it tends to create another one. Whereas if you get a good AGM, well, you've had a good AGM. Well done.
Yeah, totally. But of course, this all depends on you really doing a good job. And I think that's where quality comes in, and where people working on the gray market not only destroy the market, but destroy people's confidence in interpreting. Because as soon as, I don't know, one of these managers, he is really bad interpreter at a conference, he just thinks, I might just do it in English next time. So obviously it's quite difficult to, you can't really ban people from being bad interpreters, but I don't know what you could do.
I'm also beginning to think that, assuming basic level training, the quality of the interpreter isn't always determined by the interpreter, if that makes sense. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the word quality anyway, but if, for example, you have a client who sends in an accurate brief and the paperwork doesn't make any sense, or the paperwork doesn't really, there's a whole lot of factors that can destroy the quality of interpreting, even if you have the world's best interpreter. And there's a whole lot of things that can make mediocre interpreters look really good. And actually, the more I study clients, the more I realize they're not judging interpreting with the same criteria that we are.
No, obviously not. But
and if you learn their criteria, you actually realize that there are things that we take as gospel that aren't as important to them. They've got their own priorities. That's why I don't like the word quality, because I don't think we can ever set a kind of universal set of criteria.
Yeah, it's not a useful term. That's true.
Oh, I'm going to get in so much trouble from Franz for saying that.
You'll be all right.
He'll be hitting me over the head with the Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies in a minute.
Ooh,
Jonathan, if you have any sort of geeky questions about the research methodology, this is probably a good time to get them in. Otherwise, we can move on.
Yeah, let's move on.
Well, you're not going to ask about the survey design and that thing. But yeah, I think, Karin, I don't know if we really, I think we got sidetracked when I asked the question earlier of how you sort of approached your thesis or the work. I mean, how did you get started on working on ELF? Did you? I mean, you said you looked at previous research, and I suppose you talked to other scholars as well. But I mean, what was sort of your method? Did you look at a lot of literature? Did you have a survey or both?
Well, no, I had something like an experiment, but it was sure from the beginning that it would have to be listener-based, listener-focused. I didn't just want to look at what do interpreters do with ELF or so. I wanted to see whether we have an added value, and you can only do that by seeing what an audience with interpreting versus an audience with ELF would, I don't know, take away from speech.
Yeah.
So what I did, or what we did in this whole research group, because two of the other people, not Cornelia Zwischenberger, but two of my other colleagues also then used the same method, was we had a big audience. For me, it was all together with the pilot study, about 140 people who listened to an original speech by an Italian speaking English. Italians again, but he was a professor at Bocconi University, so he was somebody who was very used to giving speeches or speaking English, but with a very clear Italian accent. So half of the audience would listen to him and then do a comprehension test, more or less, based only on information that was only given in the speech. So it was not prior knowledge they could have, because it was a very kind of exotic thing he talked about. And then the other half of the listeners would listen to an interpreter doing the same speech into German, and also had to do this comprehension test. And the thing was, the audience was, it was an Austrian audience, but somebody might say, okay, that's not comparable, but this is comparable for a conference situation, because people say, okay, we can have a conference in Austria without interpreters, and they all listen to English and they understand it just as well.
Yeah.
And I wanted to show that it's not true. and I managed.
So this,
to
yeah.
show
Oh, great. Okay, before you give us the results, so this a mock event? This was just set up for the research, or did you? Yeah, okay. So you had sort of artificial conditions that you were able to
totally
to steer everything.
But
Okay, cool.
The thing is, the participants were students, so it was an artificial situation, but it was still more or less like a lecture they would have anyway. So it wasn't that artificial. It was, they knew there was an experiment, but it wasn't a situation that wouldn't happen to them in a usual learning environment.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a really interesting choice because doing it experimentally actually it takes away some of the standard variables, like it's not a real event, so you don't have to worry about, air conditioning and background noise and how representative it is. But on the other hand, I think for me, ELF always comes in a kind of very specific context. So people are speaking English for a reason, they're speaking German for a reason. Were there any kind of field studies or studies of real interpreting events that you were able to relate your work to and say, this is what we found in our experiment, and also there's work on, if you like, real life events that suggest that the pattern's true there as well?
No, not really, because that's the thing. Obviously, with any experiment, you have variables that get in the way. But the thing is, we try to make it as real life as possible. So it's very well in the academic field or in the field of scholarly conferences. This would just be completely normal setting. Having an Italian professor from a university speak to students of the same kind of area of specialization on a certain topic. So that would be quite realistic.
absolutely.
He was, well, I did a lot of, actually, I think, Alexander, you might have taken part in that. I made sure that the accent of the Italian speaker was, not too strong and not too weak. I didn't want somebody like, Trapattoni. That would have given great results, obviously. But I wanted to have somebody who sounded like, an average user of English as lingua franca, and who wasn't too bad a speaker of English, really, because that would just have been ridiculous. And we tried in the whole design of the experiment to make everything as realistic as possible, even if it then wouldn't have given that great results.
But I mean, speaking of results, you said a moment ago that you were able to show that it does make a difference. So if you can give us the results sort of in a nutshell, what would you say?
The comprehension test, in the comprehension test, you could score a maximum of 19 points. And the group listening to the Italian speaker speaking English scored 8 points. And the other group listening to the interpretation scored 12 points, which was a statistically significant.
I knew you were going to say that. Significant.
Oh my God, I don't remember how I did the whole statistics. I completely forgot about that. It's horrible statistics.
It's quite the skill that but you need to have it, I think, for a work like this.
And we really made sure that we get that right, because you have so many studies in interpreting with 6 participants, and then they do statistical analysis that is not really that useful. So we wanted to make sure we get that right, and this is also why we tried to get big audience.
And I think as well, then it's a trade-off between getting big audience and stats versus getting an event where there could be 20 people or 40 people, and you're not going to get as good stats, but you'll get more kind of you'll get an actual event. It's a really difficult trade-off, and I don't think a lot of people understand this about interpreting studies, is that I'm a field researcher, so I know straight away that my variables won't be controlled. The respondent size could be anything, and I'm going to have to work really, really hard to analyze it as deeply as I can, because you might not get another shot back. But if you're an experimentalist, your variables are controlled, your sizes might be better, but you're going to get an annoying field researcher at some point saying, that's not necessarily the same as real life.
These field researchers. But I think that's the thing about quantitative and qualitative research. I think none of the two is better, or it has to be a combination of both, and both have their merits. So I think obviously if you do quantitative research, you have some restrictions. Obviously, if you do qualitative research, you have your restrictions. But we're not looking for the absolute truth. Well, we are really, but we would find it.
Would be nice, though.
Yeah, it would be nice.
I mean, it's not necessarily a difference between qualitative and quantitative, because you can do quantitative field research, although it's hard to get it right. But yeah, it is this difference between what are you prepared to accept and what makes a good result. And to be able to get that much of a gap in the two conditions is impressive. Because we make a lot of small differences in interpreting studies sometimes, but to get between 8 to 12, that's good enough that you can go, fair enough, we'll take that. And it's the kind of result you can take back to clients and go, what would you like, this or this?
Well, unfortunately, they haven't really responded to it that well. But it's actually, the results, I think, are being used by our colleague Jose Turri. Alexander probably knows.
Oh,
he
yes.
works at well, maybe you want to say what he does. But yeah.
Well, he's a staff interpreter in the Spanish booth in the European Commission, DG SCIC, and he's been doing basically awareness raising and training among EU officials. So he basically brings together a group of ordinary, commission officials working in whatever field you can imagine, non-interpreters, and he tries to he tries to show them the added value of interpreting. So he does a role plays with them on what it's like, what good practice and bad practice is in a multilingual meeting. So how you take into consideration that there are interpreters and how to make the most of it. So that was it could have been much shorter, but that's basically what he's doing.
I mean, we've kind of begged a question here. And yes, that was the correct use of begging a question. No, we've kind of begged the question here as to whether interpreters themselves know what the added value of interpreting is. Because I've come across not so much interpreters our age, but maybe slightly older. And I remember talking to a colleague about this, that there are many interpreters whose view of interpreting is, we just get the ideas across, or we just say what the speaker said. And so naturally, if your view of interpreting is, we just say what the speaker said, you can't see the added value, you can't see how we're any better than machines, and all you see is all of these threats. And I wonder how easy it would be to turn it around and say, actually, the people who we need to convince of our added value first are our colleagues. Then once they're convinced, it's a far easier to sell to clients, because then we've had the confidence of actually building a community already that gets it. I did an interview with a PR professional for my upcoming book, and he said, what you do is you start with your easiest audience first. And once they get it and once they understand the message, then they can tell everyone else with you. He said the problem is that people try to do PR without having convinced the easiest audience and wondered why it's such an uphill struggle.
Yeah, could be true. I have to say, I don't know that many interpreters who have this kind of idea of interpreting that they're just, what was it? Cornelia Zwischenberger actually used that in her thing. The
conduit model.
Oh, the conduit model.
The conduit model, it never goes away.
I don't know. Not many of the interpreters I talk to about interpreting have that idea. But you might be right that it's a generational thing, maybe.
But I mean, this begs the question. At least it evokes in me the question of if the key to solving this is actually to provide added value and to be to provide really good interpreting. I think then the question is, how do we do this? Because I mean, ELF brings with itself a lot of challenges, accents and sort of regional terminology, all that jazz. So I'm wondering if did you have time to look at that at all in sort of in your research?
I didn't really look at it myself, but there is some research by Michaela Abel-Mikasa that you, Jonathan, mentioned before. And she did a first set of courses at Zurich University, Winterthur actually, where they tried to focus the training on ELF, which I do say that in my work, that we have to, considering the fact that 4 out of 5 speakers are non-native speakers, we have to train the students to mainly work from English spoken by non-native speakers, which of course can be as diverse as you can imagine. But I think that should be the main, or one of the main priorities of English interpreting training nowadays, because that's what you're faced with in the end. And obviously it's quite difficult because, as I was saying, there can be so many varieties of English as a lingua franca, because you have the whole transfer of the first language of the speaker. So if the speaker is Italian, he will sound very different from somebody who's from Asia and so on. And what I did find in my study is that what helped listeners understand, and thus also interpreters understand the non-native speaker, was being familiar with English as a lingua franca in general, or non-native speakers of English. So familiarity was the only factor that actually had a significant impact on the comprehensibility or understandability. And I think this is just exposure to as many accents as possible, and it's very tricky how you do that. But I think, well, working for the EU, Alex, you certainly are more used to EU kind of accents, because I don't know, some 2 years ago I worked at a international trade union conference, and where you had all these Asian and Latin American accents, and I was completely thrown off my track, because I'm just used to this type of English as lingua franca. I'm very used to Italians or Spaniards or even maybe Lithuanians speaking English, but not so much, I don't know, somebody from Taiwan or something.
It's true. We have very little exposure to non-European speakers, period, but certainly for English as a lingua franca. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. Yeah. So I don't know, between the two of you, do you know any, do you know if any interpreting training courses already try to sort of take that on board and to provide more training or more exposure simply to non-native English for their students?
Well, as I was saying, Michaela Abel-Mikasa did that in Winterthur. There was regular courses with their regular students, and I think most teachers of English, at least have a few speeches of non-native speakers in their course. But I think it's not necessarily done in a systematic way, and I think that would, have to be the case in the future, probably.
I think also there's a need to help people understand how to pick up when words are emphasized in an unnatural place. One of the things that I find difficult is when you do an event and there are sometimes speakers who are, I'm just going to say ex-EU people who've got a job out in the wild somewhere, in some association or some business, and they're so used to EU speak, and they are so used to certain emphasis patterns. When you interpret them, you're going, I'm not sure what word they actually used there. And most of the time, if you're a professional interpreter, that's not going to be a big deal. But there are times where you think, no, I really do need to know what that actual word was, and that becomes difficult. And so schooling people, and a word like administration, the emphasis there can fall pretty much anywhere you like. And then the number of times I've heard gouvernance. And what is it? Financial is the other one I've heard a lot. And to get people used to hearing familiar words said in very unfamiliar ways, especially administration and governance.
Yeah.
It's always, they come up so often. Politically, it's right, okay. Right. Now I'm used to it, I'm fine, but when you first come across it, you think, what word is that?
I mean, it's one of those fields, isn't it, where you can really show that a native speaker like you, Jonathan, for example, is not necessarily the best situation because they may not be so used to these weird accents, to put it very, very simply and very bluntly. But it seems that this would be a good, this makes another case again for these online practicing groups, for example, where, because if you didn't have that during your interpreting training, I mean, I didn't, surely. So there's a way to sort of stay up to date with that, or have some of that training for yourself. So maybe that's something that we can take away.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good idea.
I wanted to switch to another thing real quickly, which is, and I think, Karin, we talked about this at an academic conference not too long ago. The whole, and you mentioned it earlier as well, the whole sort of judgmental attitude that exists towards ELF, BSE. We're just going to call it English for now. Apparently, you were not familiar with BSE.
BSE has a completely different connotation. In the UK, BSE means something completely different.
Of course, yes. So talking about that, and I think the thing that I mentioned to you, Karin, then was that there is this guy, Jeremy Gardner, who has this very famous guide on sort of bad English or typical English EU jargon, which is, I guess, some form of ELF or some form of English jargon in the institutions. So was that part of your research? Did I get that right? Did you look at these attitudes, or is that something that you sort of pick up when working with colleagues?
It wasn't really part of my research, but it was quite interesting, because had I read his article or his collection before I got to know the whole ELF team at Vienna University, I would have said, so that's true, because he picks out words that are used wrongly across in most of the EU institutions. And now I have to say, well, if everybody in the institutions understand it, then where's the point in saying, oh, no, sorry, in the Oxford Dictionary, it actually says, da, 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 da. That's a point of who owns the language. And I find that idea quite nice from this is from one of the ELF scholars. And he says, how can, sorry, Jonathan, native speakers still say they own this language when they don't anymore? And I kind of understand that it's not an absolute truth, but in some instances I see his point, because if everybody around the table understands it, why then ask the native speaker, is this really correct? Or, you see what I mean? Obviously you'd have to check for legal texts, because they have to be, you have to have legal certainty. But for other texts, why can language does evolve? Also when used by native speakers. So why are non-native speakers not allowed to take part in this evolution process?
Yeah, I think it also depends on what the intention behind the whole thing is. So I can't say for sure, but I mean, to some extent, I think it also serves as almost a dictionary or a guideline for English native speakers who are not familiar with this kind of jargon, who are really struggling to understand. And, they can just go to their document and look things up and see, okay, so this is what this means. All these French terms that sort of creep into EU English, for example.
Too precise.
So, yeah.
That's not
Exactly.
how we translate préciser.
Yeah.
But it reminds me, on the other hand, of the Plain English campaign here in the UK, who do their Golden Bull Awards every year. I don't know if they've done one this year. And so you've got these two, it's the prescriptivist tendency versus the descriptivist tendency. So on the one hand, if everyone in the EU understands it, that's great. But then if any of that creeps into outward-facing language and it confuses people, that's not so great. And it's the same with the Golden Bull Awards, and in fact the whole Plain English campaign is the jargon that's okay internally in a company, when that creeps out to customers and customers have no clue what they're talking about, then that's a problem. And I think it's helping people understand, and non-linguists don't always get it, that there's some things that are absolutely fine amongst the in-group, but you need to be more careful. You need to be, if you like, more standardized when you go out of that in-group. And, there's the argument that no one owns English, and I would agree with that. But I think there's also the argument of no one owns English, but if you're talking about, we need to precise this, and it's going out, and it's in a document going out to Brits, they will laugh at you.
Yeah, totally. But it's always about your target group, really. And that's the thing. Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree.
Isn't that what Scopus theory is all about?
Well, that's your target purpose, which is different. It will include an
Okay,
design.
fair enough.
but I mean, this is the other thing as well, is that people don't realize that an awful lot of language is used as a shortcut. So we've just said on this, we can say Scopus on this podcast, and there's a whole world of meaning behind that. But then if as an interpreter we went to a client and asked them to, fill in a brief and said to a client, what's the Scopus? That would be wrong.
What?
Even to an extent of saying, which booth regime should we apply? It's like, really? What?
Yeah. We have to do relay interpreting.
Yeah. What does that mean?
We think we're like Chris Akabusi running along with a metal rod in our hands to pass to someone else.
Yeah.
Or they just say, "Oh, is it really good?" It's like, yes,
it's really good.
But so, I mean, we complain about English as a lingua franca, but frankly, how much jargon and how much English as an interpreting lingua franca do we misuse it? Do we use ourselves and not realize that we're doing it? Especially those of us who do any communications heading out towards the wider world, we need to be we need to be very careful with that. And it'd be ironic if, tell people off for misusing English and then we go off and misuse English.
I certainly
Not that we would ever do that. Yeah. So, Karin, as far as I know, you're still continuing your research. Is that right?
Yeah, well,
or is it something else?
I don't really have that much time anymore because, I used to be a research assistant where I really just had time to do research, which was great. But now I'm a senior lecturer, so I have to teach a lot, and I also work at, as a conference interpreter. I don't want to give that up for sure. And I have a family, and I want to have a private life as well. So I'm trying to, I don't know, write an article or two or go to some conferences, but I'm not obviously not as deep into research as Jonathan is at the moment, because I just don't find the time. It's very sad because I like all these things, teaching, interpreting, and doing research, but I don't know. Maybe when my daughter is a bit older, I manage to do more again.
Just not enough time in the day.
So I find it goes in seasons. That there are some. I had a season not so long ago where I was interpreting so much I couldn't really do much else. And at the moment, I'm doing research and writing mostly. And we have a saying in English which is horrible to interpret, saying it swings and roundabouts.
Yes, horrible.
And this is a saying that I would never say in public. Like I would never say that as a speaker. But yeah, it's a very common thing. It swings. You just have to take it as it comes. Oh my goodness, I've done it again. Okay, the most annoying speakers of English are the native language speakers of English. We have so many sayings that are just awful.
That's true. And that's another thing, because I think some interpreters whose English might not be as good, they're sometimes happier to have a proficient non-native speakers, because he or she wouldn't use all your idioms and, I don't know, funny metaphors and funny ways of saying things. So that's the other side of the coin, really. That oh god. And
Yeah. For me, if I was ever offered the choice between an ELF speaker and a native English speaker, it would just be 6.5 dozen. See,
Right.
this is exactly the problem.
Yeah.
So send your suggestions as to what 6.5 dozen means.
To hello@troubleterps.com. And we'll forward it all to Jonathan.
What's the prize? What's the prize?
Yeah. Yeah,
It won't be
I think it's a signed copy of your next book, Jonathan. No pressure. But okay, to run things off, I already said earlier what I sort of see coming down the pipe for ELF, and that I see it may be more of a threat is not the right word, but a more I look at it with a bit more concern than I do look at translation devices and that kind of thing. But I'd be interested in your take, sort of where is ELF going, and what is it going to mean for interpreters in the next few years? If such an answer can be given, it may be different from, depending on which region of the world you're based in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely dependent on where you live. But apart from that, I think one thing is that probably in the future, more and more non-native speakers of English are going to have a higher proficiency level, simply because they learn it early at school. And when you see young people speaking English, you don't get as many with a horrible, not understandable accent, and you get more people who can really express their ideas more or less clearly. So I think on the one hand, that makes it easier or less stressful for us. On the other hand, communication without us might as well work better, but I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But I'm trying to be positive about it and be positive about all these. I can't say any countries now, but there's still some countries who don't seem to have reached that level of proficiency, even with younger people. So
including the United Kingdom.
But I mean, yeah, it is uncomfortable because, if you look at these developments, you do start to wonder what's going to happen. I don't know. What's your take, Jonathan?
I'm going to be really stereotypical here and say that...
Controversial?
Not controversial, but stereotypical. I'm going to use the word add value again. My take is that the role of the interpreter is fundamentally shifting. And if we want to be replaced, we should hold on to our traditional view of interpreting. If we want to actually get more work and more interesting work with the growth of English as a lingua franca and speech translation and all of this, then I would say we need to start thinking out of the box, and we need to start thinking, where can we add value? What can we do? What kind of events are going to need interpreters, even if people do speak English as a lingua franca? Where... I heard someone recently, I think it was Chris Durbin, who's a finance translator, saying that as far as she's concerned, the home of the excellent translator is where there's the most risk. And I would say that's probably the same. The home of the excellent interpreter is where there's the most risk. And so I would say, as interpreters, we need to learn to aim at the higher risk assignments, aim at the assignments that traditionally we would be scared of, and get our skills to the point where the clients say, this is a huge risk, we need humans. And we need interpreters.
Yeah, and what risk means depends on where you're based, what kind of clients you have, what languages you have. Or
basically, is the future of the business on the line? Are jobs on the line? Is safety on the line? Is health on the line? Is reputation on the line?
So high stakes interpreting.
Yeah. I think the home turf of interpreters in the future is going to be high stakes stuff, with a little bit of prestigious sit there and look nice in a suit stuff. But to
we can do that.
To me, the home of interpreting is going to be the high stakes stuff, where they can't just call us a month before and send us paperwork. They're actually on the phone to us going, help, what if this goes wrong? Someone asked me recently, what's your target market? And I said, clients whose palms are sweating. That's my target market.
Yeah. That's probably a good takeaway. Yeah.
No, totally. I agree. And I think it's not going to be it's not only high stakes, but also the difficult stuff, really. I mean, that's very often connected, but it's not going to be the nice and comfy conferences we all used to like, because it's not about preparation and so on. So, and this is something that Michaela Albrunnik also found in her study with interpreters, and they said, well, if they need us, then it's really difficult, and totally relates to that, or to what Jonathan just said.
I mean, also, there's a whole question here as to what difficult looks like. Difficult for some clients, it is highly technical, and there are some highly technical assignments that are fine. And difficult for other clients might mean, there's a chance that someone might get upset. It's like, well, it's just, it really, I would say the future is we need to learn to understand clients better. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a client researcher.
It's certainly also about customer education. Well, the whole ELF thing is also about customer education, is what I argue in my papers as well. That, for example, the situation I looked at, the real monologic conference setting, is where I believe we are an added value. Whereas we should also say, okay, it's true that in other settings you might do without us. And I think that gives us credibility if we say, if we really tell them where they would really need us, and where maybe not so much, we don't have to rub it in, but anyway, we can, if they ask us, say, well, in these settings, you will certainly need us. In others, it might be easier, not easier without us, but it might be also doable, maybe without us.
That gives us a lot of credibility. It's a very controversial, I know we like that word, it's a very controversial angle to take, but I think it's the right one. And it comes back to what we've discussed here quite a few times, the idea of the interpreter as a consultant, that the client doesn't just say, come and interpret, but says, what do you think about, should we have you at this management team meeting? Well, if the management team have known each other for 20 years, probably not.
Exactly.
Should we have you at this giant press conference that our investors are going to be watching? Yes, you should.
Yes, exactly. I think that gives us credibility, because as soon as we say, no, English is a lingua franca, it never works, then they know, well, of course it works.
We're being dishonest,
I've used it very often, and it worked perfectly. And so as soon as we are...
It's working right now, So.
More or less.
Yeah, working as well as English ever works.
I guess so.
We haven't mentioned Brexit, but we won't.
Yeah, well done us. Although I did, I'll put a link into the show notes about some Brexit-related stuff, because, there was this talk, at least when Brexit happened, what's going to happen to English in the EU, but that's a slightly different topic, so maybe we'll do that in another episode.
Do they speak English in the EU? I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it?
English. I never managed to make a joke about the National Health Service.
The National Health Service? Why would you joke about them?
Because health, elf, it's a pun.
Oh.
It's a shame.
Too bad you didn't get that in. Okay, enough with the politics. Now we got that out of the way. Welcome to Troublesome Terps, what was I going to say? Oh.
Podcast, maybe.
Let's not get into it. Okay. This is your last chance. Say it. Ding, ding, ding.